The wind howls against the thick masonry of the isolated 1880 estate, forcing icy drafts through every gap in the heavy wooden shutters. A single hearth breathes a defiant square of orange heat against the creeping winter darkness, though the air just paces away remains bitter and sharp. Welcome to Unwritten Axiom. I'm glad you're here. If seeking refuge in these quiet, forgotten winters brings you comfort, the subscribe button will always hold the door open for your return. You stand by the narrow window of the grand stone house as the pale winter sun dips below the barren tree line. The year is 1880, and the season has brought a relentless frost that clings to the edges of the exterior glass panes. Your breath forms small, temporary ghosts against the cold surface before vanishing into the heavy air of the room. Thick masonry holds the temperature of the season like a memory, radiating a persistent chill that no amount of burning coal can fully banish. The world outside is a muted landscape of gray and white, silent and unmoving beneath the fading light. Shadows lengthen across the polished wooden floorboards of the drawing room. A distant hound barks once from the direction of the stables, the sound muffled by the heavy velvet drapes flanking the window. Dust motes drift lazily through the final shafts of sunlight, appearing like tiny sparks suspended in the frigid air. The house groans subtly as the temperature drops, the temper joints shifting and settling into their evening configuration. This physical shift signals the daily transition from the labor of daylight to the quiet endurance of the long winter night ahead. You pull your thick woolen shawl tighter around your shoulders, feeling the coarse fibers scratch faintly against your skin. The garment smells faintly of cedar and lanolin, an earthy scent that brings a strange measure of comfort in the drafty room. Your fingers find the intricate woven fringe at the hem, tracing the pattern absent-mindedly as you watch the shadows deepen outside. Every movement requires a conscious effort against the creeping stiffness that the cold weather brings to human joints. The fabric forms a necessary barrier, trapping your body heat before it can bleed away into the cavernous space around you. Footsteps echo from the hallway, sharp and deliberate against the bare floorboards as a servant moves to tend the fires. The rhythmic sound is accompanied by the metallic rattle of a coal scuttle, a heavy iron bucket carrying the fuel needed to sustain the household. You listen as the heavy brass doorknob turns, granting entry to a rush of even colder air from the unheated corridor. The servant enters with quiet purpose, setting the iron bucket down onto the stone hearth with a dull thud. The clatter of the brass shovel against the coal is a familiar winter symphony, promising a temporary reprieve from the freezing temperatures. You watch the servant kneel before the great fireplace, expertly coaxing the dying embers back to a roaring blaze. New coal catches the heat, popping and hissing as thin ribbons of gray smoke curl upward toward the dark throat of the chimney. A sudden wave of warmth pushes out from the hearth, brushing against your face and hands with welcome intensity. The orange glow reflects off the polished brass fire irons, casting dancing patterns of light across the nearby walls. For a brief moment, the illusion of genuine warmth fills the room, though you know the heat extends only a few paces from the stone boundary. Cold drafts dominate the drawing room beyond the immediate reach of the flames. High ceilings, designed for grandeur rather than comfort, allow all the precious heat to rise and vanish into the ornate plasterwork above. Intricate tapestries hanging along the northern wall sway very slightly, revealing the invisible air currents that sneak through the mortar and brick. A person sitting near the window might as well be standing in the snow, separated from the blizzard only by thin panes of glass. The hearth serves as a vibrant island of life in the center of an otherwise frozen interior landscape. You step closer to the fire, surrendering to the physical necessity of the heat pressing against your skirts. The sudden change in temperature makes your skin prickle, a sharp contrast to the numbness that had begun to settle in your toes. The scent of burning coal is sharp and industrial, distinct from the sweet wood smoke of earlier eras, yet equally synonymous with winter survival. You hold your hands out toward the grate, allowing the radiant energy to thaw your stiff joints. The fire demands constant feeding, a ravenous companion that must be satisfied if the household is to endure the night. You observe the heavy brass carriage clock on the mantelpiece ticking with rhythmic precision, marking the steady retreat of the afternoon. The enamel dial catches the firelight, its black Roman numerals standing stark against the pale background. Beside it, a pair of tall silver candlesticks wait to be lit, their white wax tapers standing ready to combat the encroaching darkness. The rhythmic ticking serves as a mechanical heartbeat for the silent room, measuring the hours until the true cold of midnight arrives. You watch the minute hand slip past the quarter hour, acknowledging the formal arrival of dusk. You turn away from the hearth and begin the slow walk across the vast room toward the heavy double doors. The floorboards creak softly under your leather boots, the sound echoing lightly against the high plaster ceiling. Moving away from the fire feels like wading into a river of ice water, the temperature dropping sharply with every deliberate stride. You pass a large mahogany side table, trailing your fingertips along its polished edge, feeling the coldness of the solid wood. The air here holds the faint, metallic smell of old brass and the musty scent of heavy winter drapes. Lantern light struggles to penetrate the gloom of the grand hallway. The yellow flame wavers within its glass chimney, casting a pool of pale illumination that barely reaches the center of the patterned carpet. An imposing oak staircase rises into the shadows of the second floor, the carved balustrades looking like silent sentinels guarding the upper chambers. The draft in this corridor is significantly stronger, smelling of damp earth and the impending snowstorm gathering outside the estate walls. The house feels vast and empty in the twilight, a cavernous structure demanding resilience from its inhabitants. You grip the smooth wooden handrail and begin the ascent to the upper sleeping quarters. The wood is freezing to the touch, sapping the heat from your palm instantly, yet providing necessary support on the steep stairs. Your boots make muffled thuds on the woven runner, the sound absorbed by the dense fabric and the sheer volume of the surrounding space. With each step, the ambient temperature seems to drop another fraction. The upper floors historically isolated from the warmth of the lower living areas. The journey to the bedroom is a nightly migration, from the communal warmth to the solitary challenge of the cold. You pause above the landing, looking to a tall arched window that frames the darkening sky. The glass is etched with elaborate patterns of winter frost, the crystalline structures glowing faintly in the twilight. The remaining natural light is the color of bruised iron, a flat and lifeless gray that promises a bitter night. You look out over the snow-covered grounds, the manicured gardens now buried under pristine white drifts. The visual isolation of the estate reinforces the reality that survival tonight depends entirely on the resources held within these stone walls. You continue down the long upstairs corridor, the floorboards here uneven and prone to sharp groans beneath your weight. The doors to the various guest rooms are closed tight, their brass keyholes letting thin slivers of frigid air escape into the passage. A servant carrying an armful of folded linen rushes past you with a brief nod, their breath visible in the dim hallway. The urgency in their step reflects the collective effort required to prepare the household for the impending freeze. Every action taken during these twilight hours is a calculated move in the nightly battle against the dropping mercury. Bedroom doors line the long upstairs corridor, closed tight against the draft. A modest fire has already been lit in your small bedroom grate, casting a wavering orange glow across the woven rug. The heat struggles to reach the center of the large room, fighting a losing battle against the cold radiating from the exterior masonry. Heavy velvet curtains have been drawn across the windows, creating a dense barrier against the wind that rattles the wooden frames. The space feels like a fortress within a fortress, a localized attempt to carve out a habitable zone in the freezing house. You enter the room and immediately feel the specific, enclosed atmosphere of the sleeping quarters. The air smells of lavender sachets tucked into the linen press, mixed heavily with the raw scent of burning coal from the hearth. A large four-poster bed dominates the center of the floor, its dark mahogany columns reaching toward the high ceiling. Thick woolen blankets are piled high upon the mattress, a mountain of heavy textiles designed to trap body heat through the darkest hours. The bed is a strategic installation, a microclimate engineered to preserve life when the room temperature plummets. Brass warming pans represent the height of Victorian winter comfort. The long wooden handle is polished smooth by years of use, leaning patiently against the brickwork of the fireplace. The metal lid is pierced with intricate patterns, allowing the heat and faint smoke of the coals to escape into the bedding. You know that soon a servant will scoop glowing embers into the pan and slide it between the layers of your bed. This ritual is the only way to endure the initial shock of crawling beneath the frozen covers later in the evening. You approach the heavy mahogany wardrobe, its mirrored doors reflecting the dancing flames of the small fire. The mirror glass is cold and slightly distorted, casting a shadowed, wavering reflection of the room behind you. The hinges issue a low metallic protest as you pull the heavy doors open, revealing a dark interior smelling of cedar wood and old fabric. A row of thick flannel nightgowns hangs waiting, their coarse material prioritizing function and warmth over any pretense of elegance. Clothing in this season is armor, and preparing for rest requires donning additional layers rather than removing them. You begin the evening routine, prioritizing the careful management of both clothing and the surrounding environment to ensure safety. A porcelain wash basin sits on a corner stand, the water within it already forming a thin crust of ice around the edges. You crack the thin ice with your knuckles, the sharp sound startling in the quiet room before dipping a cloth into the freezing water. The shock of the cold against your face is immediate and bracing, a physical jolt that clears the mind of the day's lingering fatigue. This harsh ablution is brief, executed quickly to minimize exposure to the freezing air of the chamber. You discard your heavy daytime shawl and reach for the thickest flannel nightdress in the wardrobe. The fabric is stiff from the cold, resisting slightly as you pull it over your head and settle it around your shoulders. The material falls heavy and dense against your legs, providing an immediate layer of insulation against the ambient chill. A knitted woolen cap is placed carefully over your hair, securing the heat that would otherwise escape from the top of your head into the dark room. You are now bundled like a traveler setting out on a long journey, though your destination is merely the center of the room. Radiant heat from the newly stoked fire warms the front of your flannel gown. You use the heavy iron poker to shift a large chunk of coal, exposing the red-hot core and sending a shower of bright sparks up the chimney. The draft pulls the smoke efficiently, but a faint bitter tang still manages to escape into the bedroom air. The warmth creates a stark contrast with the icy chill pressing against your back. Maintaining the fire is a constant, quiet chore that anchors the evening rhythm and preserves the habitability of the room. You sink into an upholstered armchair beside the hearth, pulling your feet up onto the small footstool to keep them off the drafty floor. The upholstery is worn but comfortable, smelling faintly of old tobacco and beeswax polish from years of careful maintenance. The silence of the estate is profound now, the daytime activities of the household having surrendered fully to the advancing night. Only the erratic ticking of the mantel clock and the low hiss of the coal fire break the pervasive quiet. This solitary hour is a time for quiet reflection, an enforced stillness dictated by the severity of the winter outside. Muffled knocking sounds at the oak door, pulling your attention away from the flames. The door swings open to admit a young maid carrying a steaming jug of water and the brass warming pan now filled with glowing embers. She moves with practiced efficiency, pulling back the heavy wool blankets to expose the pristine, freezing linen sheets beneath. The brass pan slides smoothly between the layers, releasing a faint cloud of steam and the distinct dry smell of hot metal. You watch the ritual with silent appreciation, knowing the difference that fleeting warmth will make in a few moments. You nod as the maid retrieves the pan and smooths the heavy blankets back into place, sealing the precious heat inside the bed. She offers a brief, respectful curtsy before slipping back out the door, her footsteps fading quickly down the dark corridor. You are left alone once more, the chamber feeling a fraction more hospitable thanks to the heated linens waiting for you. The window shutters rattle with heavy force as a sudden gust of wind strikes the side of the manor, a loud reminder of the hostile forces kept at bay. The stone walls stand firm, silent defenders in the ceaseless war against the elements. You trace the carved mahogany armrest of your chair, feeling the dense grain of the wood beneath your fingertips. The sheer mass of the heavy furniture provides a sense of security, an anchor in the vast and drafty chamber. Another gust of wind strikes the side of the manor, rattling the heavy interior shutters and sending a fresh wave of cold air across the carpet. The masonry joints creak under the atmospheric pressure, a sound that has echoed through these halls for generations. You draw the flannel gown tighter, preparing for the long vigil of the evening as the temperature continues to plummet. Heavy atmospheric pressures down upon the silent household. The coarse wool of your outer shawl smells faintly of the sheep it came from, a natural and earthy scent that belongs to rural survival. A draught sneaks past the drawn velvet curtains, brushing an icy finger across your exposed cheek and nose. You pull the fabric up a fraction higher, defending the last vulnerable inches of your face from the creeping chill. The isolation of the 1880 winter is absolute, severing the estate from the rest of the world until the morning light returns. You remain perfectly still in the armchair, listening to the vast house settling deeper into the grip of the freezing temperature. The timber framing groans in the cold, a deep and resonant sound that travels through the walls and floorboards. Downstairs, a heavy door thuds shut, the sound muffled by distance and the thick carpets lining the corridors. The fire in your own grate ticks and pops, its light failing to reach the dark corners of the large room. The darkness outside the window is heavy, a dense blindfold that forces your other senses to become hyper-aware of the interior environment. Icy rain scatters suddenly against the exterior brickwork. The weather outside is deteriorating rapidly, transforming the serene snowy landscape into a brutal and unforgiving wasteland. The thick window glass shudders under the assault, but the heavy wooden shutters absorb the worst of the impact, keeping the gale at bay. The contrast between the storm outside and the stillness of your layered clothing amplifies the feeling of sanctuary. You focus on the rhythm of the ticking clock, a steady mechanical pulse in the freezing room. Glowing coals shift in the fireplace, collapsing into a heap of dull red ash. The temperature in the room drops noticeably as the radiant heat fades, leaving the stone walls to reclaim their icy dominance. The air becomes sharp to breathe, stinging the inside of your nostrils with its pure, frozen clarity. The long hours of endurance have begun, demanding patience and the hushed resignation to the elements of the season. You sit in the dimming light, fully awake and vigilant, listening to the winter wage its war against the stone estate. You listen to the distant sound of a horse shifting in its stable across the courtyard. The muted clatter of hooves against straw provides a brief reminder of the living creatures enduring the same freezing temperatures outside. Even the animals require heavy blankets and constant attention to survive the severity of the 880 winter season. The coachman is likely performing his own cold vigil, ensuring the water troughs do not freeze solid before midnight. Every soul on the estate is bound by the identical necessity of generating and preserving heat against the elements. Frost continues to map its intricate geometric patterns across the interior surface of the window glass. The crystalline structures grow visibly, branching out like silver ferns as the ambient heat in the room diminishes. You reach out to touch the lowest pane, jerking your hand back instantly as the freezing surface bites into your skin. The boundary between the violent storm and your fragile sanctuary feels dangerously thin in these hushed moments of observation. The masonry walls are robust, but the thermal reality of the era offers very few true comforts. You observe the heavy velvet drapes swaying again, pushed by the invisible pressure of the exterior gale. The fabric absorbs the draft, billowing slightly before settling back against the brass tiebacks mounted to the plaster wall. These heavy textiles are as essential to your survival as the coal burning in the grate, forming a secondary wall against the night. The rich burgundy color of the velvet seems to absorb the wavering firelight, deepening the shadows around the edges of the room. This visual isolation shrinks your world down to the immediate radius of the hearth and the armchair. Distance and chimes from the grandfather clock in the lower hall resonate through the heavy floor timbers. The deep metallic notes strike the hour, marking the official transition from the fading twilight into the deep evening. You count the slow strikes automatically, registering the passage of time as a necessary march toward the eventual dawn. The sound is mournful and resonant, emphasizing the cavernous size of the old manor and its echoing empty corridors. Time moves differently in the freezing cold, stretching each minute into a physical test of patience and endurance. You fold your hands tightly in your lap, pressing them against the thick flannel to conserve the remaining warmth. The muscles in your shoulders carry a dull ache from shivering, a persistent tension that the dying fire cannot alleviate. Survival in this historic era requires an acceptance of chronic discomfort, a constant negotiation with the environment that modern minds rarely comprehend. You prepare yourself mentally for the long vigil ahead, knowing the true depth of the night is still hours away. The estate holds its breath beneath the snow, a silent fortress locked in combat with the winter sky. You step away from the armchair and cross the woven rug, leaving the meager warmth of the bedroom hearth behind. The heavy oak door protests on its brass hinges, a sharp metallic whine that slices through the stillness of the upper floor. Corridor shadows stretch endlessly before you. They are broken only by the wavering light of a single oil lamp placed on a mahogany console. The air in this passage is markedly colder than your chamber, smelling of stale dust and the pervasive dampness of the stone masonry. You pull the thick flannel tighter around your neck, anticipating the physical toll of navigating the unheated sections of the sprawling manor. Distant clattering from the lower levels signals the ongoing labor required to sustain the household through the freezing night. The back staircase offers a narrower and less drafty descent than the grand central foyer. These wooden treads are worn smooth in the center. They bear the physical evidence of countless trips carrying coal, water, and heavy linens. You grip the rough iron handrail, feeling its biting chill bleed straight through the fabric of your sleeves and into your palm. This secondary artery of the house lacks the ornate plasterwork and heavy tapestries of the primary halls, leaving the bare brick exposed to the freezing air. You pause on the landing just above the ground floor, listening to the muffled voices echoing from the estate kitchen. The heavy oak door separating the servant quarters from the main house stands slightly ajar, allowing a thick wedge of yellow light to spill onto the stone flags. The pungent aroma of roasting mutton and boiling root vegetables pushes back against the sterile, metallic scent of the freezing corridor. The contrast is sharp. You push the door wider, stepping into a cavernous room dominated by a massive cast-iron cooking range that radiates a fierce, necessary heat. The scale of the kitchen underscores the immense logistical effort required simply to keep the inhabitants fed and functioning during the brutal season. Copper pots hang suspended from heavy ceiling beams, catching the bright orange glow of the open firebox and reflecting it into the dark corners. The estate cook commands the space with calculated, efficient movements. She wears layers of coarse gray wool and a heavily stained apron to ward off the chill at her back. She lifts a heavy iron kettle from the hottest part of the stove, the physical exertion evident in the tight lines of her weathered face. Steam billows upward in a thick cloud, condensing on the freezing window panes and obscuring the black night outside. Scullery maids scrub root vegetables in wooden tubs of icy water, their bare hands raw and cracked from the relentless exposure to the freezing liquid. You observe the frantic rhythm of the evening meal preparation, a stark contrast to the hushed isolation of your upstairs chamber. The cook slides a heavy iron pan onto the hottest plate. The searing sound of animal fat masks the persistent howling of the wind in the chimney. Baskets of winter squash and pale turnips sit stacked against the limestone wall, their dull colors reflecting the limited bounty of the frozen earth. You feel the radiant energy of the stove press against your chest, an overwhelming sensation that leaves your back shivering in the crossdraft. The maids move quickly, carrying stacks of thick porcelain plates toward the warming oven to prevent the food from freezing the moment it is served. Frost creeps stubbornly along the edges of the kitchen stone floor, defying the immense heat generated just a few yards away. The moisture from the boiling pots creates a slick, hazardous film on the flagstones. It requires deliberate steps to avoid a disastrous fall. The heavy oak service door bangs shut as a young boy enters carrying another bucket of black coal, his face smeared with soot and flushed from the biting wind. He dumps the fuel into the iron bin with a deafening clatter, a harsh acoustic reminder of the raw materials necessary to sustain the manor. The firebox demands constant feeding, devouring the hard-won resources with a ravenous appetite that never ceases throughout the winter months. You turn away from the chaotic heat at the stove and move toward the formal dining room. The transition jarring. The narrow service corridor leading to the main hall is an acoustic tunnel, amplifying the creak of your boots and the rustle of your flannel gown. The air here loses the savory smell of roasting meat. It is replaced by the parched scent of old wax and polished mahogany. You push open the swinging baize door, stepping into a vast, rectangular cavern that feels more like a mausoleum than a place of gathering. The long dining table stretches into the gloom, its polished surface reflecting the meager light of a single chandelier. Heavy silver candelabras stand empty on the sideboard, their elaborate scrollwork tarnished by the pervasive dampness of the season. The dining chairs sit rigidly along the perimeter. They are upholstered in dark green leather, their brass tacks catching the faint glint of the distant hearth. The walls are paneled in dark oak, a feature intended to add grandeur but currently serving only to absorb whatever light and heat manage to exist here. A draft sweeps beneath the massive velvet curtains, causing the fringe to tremble and sending a localized current of freezing air across your ankles. The room waits in frozen expectation, a monument to social convention that ignores the brutal dictates of the winter weather. You walk the length of the dining table, trailing a hand along the icy surface of the mahogany, feeling the grain beneath the polish. The single fire burning in the marble grate is largely performative, its heat consumed by the massive brick chimney and the high, molded ceiling. You stand directly before the flames. The radiant warmth fails to penetrate the thick layers of your clothing. The marble mantelpiece is freezing to the touch, a massive slab of stone that acts as a thermal sink, pulling heat away from the surrounding air. The acoustic emptiness of the room amplifies the sound of the wind tearing at the exterior slates, a constant threat pressing against the mortar. You note the 8th hour passing as the temperature outside plunges further, creating a sharp cracking sound as the frost expands within the brickwork. The formal dining room offers no true shelter, prompting you to seek a more defensible position within the vast estate. You exit through a pair of tall double doors, crossing the wide central foyer where the cold rules unmitigated by any heat source. The marble tiles of the entryway bite fiercely through the soles of your boots. It is a harsh tactile reminder of the frozen earth beneath the foundation. You move swiftly toward the library, hoping the smaller dimensions and the density of the books will offer some resistance to the cold. You push the heavy walnut door of the library open, greeted instantly by the complex scent of deteriorating leather, dry paper, and old pipe ash. The room is smaller than the dining hall. Its walls line tightly with tall oak bookcases that provide a crude form of insulation. A robust fire burns brightly in the small iron grate. Its heat is contained effectively by the dense configuration of the furniture and the books. You feel the immediate difference in the air pressure. The drafty violence of the corridor is replaced by a stagnant, heavy chill. The leather wing-back chairs pull closely around the hearth, forming a tight defensive perimeter against the creeping frost from the window panes. Thick, musky odors from the bound volumes mingle with the sharp tang of burning coal, creating an atmosphere of intellectual isolation. You run a finger along the spine of a heavy encyclopedia, the leather cover cold and stiff, the gold leaf lettering dull in the firelight. A globe of the world sits on a mahogany stand in the corner, its varnished surface reflecting a worked image of the dancing flames. The books act as a thermal barrier. They absorb the cold radiating from the exterior walls and prevent it from fully penetrating the seating area. The silence here is dense and fibrous, muting the persistent howling of the wind outside. You sit heavily in one of the leather armchairs, the material groaning and resisting under the sudden weight. The firelight paints shifting, erratic patterns across the rows of books, highlighting the embossed titles and the intricate tooling on the spines. You stretch your hands toward the iron grate. You feel the fierce heat bake the front of your flannel gown, while the leather chair remains icy against your back. The contrast is uncomfortable but necessary, a physical representation of the constant negotiation between freezing and burning. You focus on the geometry of the flames, watching the coal fracture and crumble into glowing orange fragments as the fuel is consumed. Shadows lengthen and contract across the patterned carpet, dictated by the irregular rhythm of the burning coal. The heavy velvet curtains in this room are drawn tight, sealed with brass clasps to prevent the gale from finding a way inside. The sound of the storm is reduced to a low, continuous vibration that shudders through the timber framing and the glass panes. You notice a fine layer of dust settling on the polished surface of a side table. It remains untouched by the servants in their rush to secure the house. The library, with its accumulated knowledge and contained heat, acts as the final redoubt against the encroaching elements. You lean forward to adjust a crumbling piece of coal with the heavy iron tongs, the metallic clink ringing sharply in the muted room. The sudden shift in the firebox sends a fresh plume of gray smoke up the chimney, carrying with it the distinct metallic scent of the fuel. You watch the new coal catch, the edges glowing cherry red before igniting into a blue-tipped flame. The heat pushes against your face, forcing you to lean back into the rigid, freezing leather of the armchair. This localized warmth is a precious commodity, hoarded carefully within the narrow confines of the hearth's reach. The vast majority of the estate remains a frozen wasteland, a sprawling monument to architectural hubris in the face of natural extremes. Polished brass framing the ornate barometer hangs on the oak paneling near the door, its needle pointing stubbornly towards severe and unsettled weather. The glass face is cold to the touch. The internal mechanisms react invisibly to the massive atmospheric pressure pressing down on the region. The scientific instrument offers no comfort, only cold confirmation of the brutal reality existing just inches beyond the brick exterior. You stare at the brass dial, acknowledging the mechanical truth that the temperatures will continue to plummet as the deep evening progresses. The mahogany casing of the barometer creaks suddenly, a sharp acoustic crack that sounds like a pistol shot in the quiet room. You rise from the armchair, driven by a restless need to inspect the perimeter of your temporary sanctuary. The heavy woven rug offers marginal protection from the icy floorboards, the thick wool fibers crushing beneath the soles of your boots. You move toward the heavy velvet drapes, slipping a hand behind the fabric to feel the extreme temperature of the window glass. The cold radiating from the pane is intense, stinging your knuckles and confirming that the frost is actively seeking entry. The physical barrier between survival and freezing is alarmingly thin, relying strictly on the integrity of the Victorian mortar and the constant supply of black coal. You withdraw your hand quickly, letting the heavy fabric fall back into place to seal the breach. You feel the deep silence of the library broken only by the settling of the ash in the grate. The rhythmic ticking of a pocket watch on the side table measures the progression of the night. Each second a small victory against the elements. The heat from the fire has plateaued, reaching the maximum capacity that the small iron box can generate in this space. You pull your thick flannel nightgown tighter, feeling the raw edge of the cold pressing against the boundaries of the radiant warmth. The intellectual comfort of the books surrounding you offers no physical relief from the dropping mercury. The estate is a ship navigating a frozen ocean, dependent upon its internal furnaces to avoid sinking into the ice. You reach for a heavy, leather-bound volume on the nearest shelf, pulling it free with the scrape of thick paper against wood. The book is remarkably cold, its mass having absorbed the ambient chill of the room despite its proximity to the fire. You open the cover, the stiff binding crackling in protest, and run your fingers over the rough, unbleached pages. The faint smell of deteriorating ink and damp sizing rises from the paper, a testament to the decades it has spent enduring these harsh winters. The tactile sensation of the freezing leather and the rough paper grounds your thoughts. The howling wind threatens to strip away all sense of security as the night deepens. Sharp, resinous smells from the polished oak shelving provide a grounding counterpoint to the pervasive odor of the coal smoke. You slide the heavy volume back into its exact place, ensuring the tight configuration of the books remains unbroken against the exterior wall. The fire ships again, a large piece of fuel breaking apart and sending a shower of bright orange embers cascading onto the stone hearth. The sudden flare of light throws chaotic, leaping shadows across the ceiling, briefly animating the static rows of literature. You watch the embers dim and cool in the cold stone, their life cycle a rapid and brutal metaphor for the struggle occurring throughout the house. The library, for all its dense insulation, is slowly losing ground to the relentless pressure of the 1880 winter. You abandon the leather armchair as the mantel clock begins its slow sequence of chimes marking 11. The fire has deteriorated into a useless pile of gray ash, offering no further resistance against the dropping temperature. You lift a heavy brass chamber stick from the side table and strike a sulfur match against the abrasive strip. The sudden flare smells sharp and chemical, burning your nostrils for a brief second before settling into a steady yellow teardrop. You cup your free hand around the fragile light to protect it from the draft sweeping through the library. The door handle feels like a block of solid ice beneath your fingers as you turn it. Stepping back into the main corridor requires a mental brace against the physical shock of the unheated air. The hallway stretches out in front of you, a long tunnel of darkness where the architectural grandeur is lost to the gloom. Your boots drag slightly on the woven runner, the sound muffled but distinct in the oppressive silence of the house. The temperature here is brutal, biting straight through the thick flannel of your nightgown and the heavy wool shawl. You walk with a rigid posture, your muscles tensed involuntarily against the hostile environment pressing in from all sides. Every surface in this passage radiates a penetrating chill that saps the energy from your bones. You approach the rear of the estate where the iron-framed door leads into the grand glass conservatory. The heavy iron latch is coated in a thin layer of white rime, the moisture from the adjacent rooms having frozen solid upon the metal. You grip the handle and force it downward, the mechanism grinding with a harsh metallic shriek that echoes down the empty corridor. The door pulls open with reluctant stiffness, breaking the ice seal and releasing a wave of odor from the dying garden. The smell of wet earth, rotting vegetation, and severe frost rolls over you in a stagnant cloud. You cross the threshold into the massive glass structure, entering a space that feels like the belly of a frozen leviathan. The architectural ambition of the vaulted ceiling is mocked by the ferocity of the 1880 blizzard raging just inches above the fragile panes. Iron support girders groan under the sheer weight of the accumulating snow, the metal contracting and pinging sharply in the glacial air. The The wind shrieks through the overlapping glass seams, a continuous, deafening roar that makes conversation impossible even if another soul were present. You hold the candle higher, the meager light reflecting back at you from 100 black frost-covered mirrors. Exotic plants from distant continents stand ruined in their ornate terracotta pots, their leaves blackened and curled by the catastrophic drop in temperature. You brush your fingers against the frond of a massive fern, and the dead foliage crumbles into brittle, frozen shards. The dedicated estate gardeners fought a losing battle here, their attempts to maintain a tropical sanctuary defeated by the unprecedented severity of the winter. Massive cast iron heating pipes run along the perimeter of the brick floor, designed to circulate steam and preserve the fragile flora. You reach down to touch the thick metal cylinder, finding it stone cold and devoid of life-saving heat. The scent of crushed citrus lingers faintly near a towering lemon tree that has succumbed to the deep freeze. You observe the shriveled yellow fruit hanging like grim ornaments among the dead, frost-rimmed branches. The loss of these prized specimens represents a massive financial blow to the estate, a clear demonstration that nature answers to no human authority. Water from melting snow has seeped through the failing roof joints and frozen across the red brick floor, creating a treacherous sheet of black ice. You navigate the slippery surface with extreme caution, your boots seeking traction on the uneven masonry to avoid a disastrous fall in the dark. You pull the heavy iron door shut behind you, retreating from the dead conservatory and sealing the frozen garden away. The mechanical click of the latch engaging offers a small, psychological comfort, though the temperature in the corridor is only marginally better. The realization that the perimeter of the house is failing drives you toward the lower levels to inspect the foundational survival systems. You move toward the servant stairs that lead down into the expanse of cellars, the true mechanical heart of the sprawling Victorian manor. The stone steps are steep and worn, descending into a pitch-black void that smells of damp limestone and ancient dust. Shadows leap and distort against the curved brick walls of the stairwell as your candle flame dances in the updraft. You descend slowly, one hand sliding along the numbing masonry wall for balance while the other keeps the light steady. The air pressure changes as you move below ground, the atmosphere becoming dense, stagnant, and heavily laden with the scent of raw earth. The ambient noise of the windstorm is muffled down here, replaced by the hollow, echoing drip of condensation falling into unseen puddles. This subterranean world was built for storage and endurance. Stripped of all the ornamental pretense found on the floors above, you step off the final stair onto the packed dirt floor of the main cellar vault, the ground hard as iron beneath your boots. Massive oak barrels line the perimeter, their curved wooden flanks bound by rusted iron hoops and filled with preserving ale. The temperature in the cellar is stable but bitterly cold, a damp chill that bypasses your woolen layers and settles directly into your joints. You walk past rows of wooden bins holding the winter root harvest, the smell of raw turnips and dusty potatoes hanging thick in the air. The provisions are meager against the length of the season, requiring strict rationing to ensure the household survives until the spring thaw. You turn down a narrow brick archway leading toward the primary coal bunkers, the source of the estate's fading lifeblood. The smell of sulfur and crushed carbon grows stronger with every step, a harsh industrial odor that coats the back of your throat. Giant piles of black fuel rise toward the vaulted ceiling, their jagged surfaces absorbing the candlelight without reflecting a single beam. You run a hand over a large chunk of anthracite, feeling the sharp, dusty edges of the mineral that buys the manor another day of existence. The sheer volume of the hoard is impressive, yet you know the numerous hearths upstairs will devour it with terrifying speed. A faint orange glow emanates from a small alcove near the main furnace doors, drawing your attention through the gloom. You discover an exhausted stoker sitting on an overturned wooden crate, his body wrapped tightly in a frayed horse blanket. He huddles over a small iron brazier filled with glowing coke, prioritizing his own immediate survival in the freezing basement. His face is obscured by soot and grime, and his breath forms a continuous, thick white plume in the icy air. He offers a brief, silent nod of acknowledgement, too weary and numb to stand or speak in the presence of the household authority. You stand near the makeshift fire for a moment, allowing the primitive heat to bake the front of your damp woolen gown. The brazier emits a distinct smell of hot metal and burning impurities, a harsh sensory experience that grounds you in the gritty reality of the era. This solitary laborer represents the unseen human cost of maintaining the estate, his physical suffering ensuring the survival of those sleeping in the chambers above. You offer no words of comfort, knowing that platitudes hold no value against the crushing weight of the 1880 winter. The exchange is purely silent, a mutual recognition of the brutal conditions shared by every soul trapped within the stone walls. You turn away from the stoker and begin the arduous climb back up the steep stone staircase to the ground floor. The physical exertion of the ascent forces your heart to beat harder, pumping a brief illusory warmth through your stiff limbs. Your leather boots scrape against the uneven treads, the sound echoing hollowly down the brick shaft behind you. The air grows noticeably thinner and sharper as you approach the main level, the stagnant dampness of the cellar giving way to the biting drafts of the corridors. You emerge through the heavy service door, the brass handle cold enough to burn your palm as you pull it shut. Midnight approaches as you navigate the grand central foyer once again, the vast open space feeling like the interior of a glacier. The marble statues of long-dead ancestors stare blindly into the darkness, their pale features looking like frozen corpses in the wavering candlelight. You cross the intricately patterned floor tiles, keeping your eyes fixed on the massive oak staircase that leads back to your isolated chamber. The house groans again, a deep structural complaint as the dropping mercury causes the timber framing to contract with sudden force. The sound travels through the soles of your boots, a physical vibration that confirms the immense environmental stress placed upon the building. Hot wax spills over the brass lip of your chamber stick, landing on your exposed knuckle with a sharp, stinging bite. You flinch but maintain your grip on the handle, the pain providing a sudden anchor to your physical body. The smell of melted tallow is rich and cloying, a distinct odor that will forever be associated with these long, nocturnal wanderings. You reach the bottom step of the grand staircase, resting your hand on the carved, newel post to gather your strength. The climb ahead feels like a monumental task, your muscles aching with the persistent fatigue brought on by the constant shivering. You ascend the wide wooden steps slowly, the heavy fabric of your nightgown trailing behind you and sweeping the dust from the runner. The darkness on the upper landing is absolute, swallowing the meager illumination provided by your single, struggling candle flame. The wind outside has found a new, higher pitch, screaming around the stone turrets and tearing at the slate shingles with unimaginable force. You reach the top of the stairs, your breathing shallow and rapid from the effort of moving the heavy layers of winter clothing. The corridor stretching toward your bedroom looks like a tunnel carved through solid ice, devoid of any welcoming light or heat. You pause before the tall arched window at the end of the hall, inspecting the glass that separates you from the raging blizzard. The frost has now colonized the entire pane, building up in thick, opaque ridges that block out any trace of the night sky. The window is no longer a portal to the outside world, but a solid wall of white ice entombed within the wooden frame. You press your palm flat against the frozen surface, feeling the lethal cold of the 1880 winter transmit directly through the barrier. The sensation is terrifying in its purity, a stark reminder of the fragile boundary keeping you alive. You withdraw your hand and turn back toward the final stretch of the dark hallway, your shadow leaping erratically against the flocked wallpaper. The true depth of the night has only just begun, and the hours stretching before dawn will test the limits of human endurance. Every step taken on the creaking floorboards is a testament to resilience, a refusal to surrender to the freezing temperatures invading the estate. You carry the small brass chamber stick like a talisman, the tiny flame representing the stubborn will to survive the darkness. The isolated stone manor holds its breath, waiting for the morning sun that feels as though it may never return. You push the heavy oak door of your bedroom open, the brass latch biting into your bare palm with the ferocity of solid ice. The chamber feels marginally less hostile than the yawning corridors of the estate, though the small coal fire has burned down to a dull, pulsing cherry red. Shadows crowd the corners of the room, held back only by the wavering yellow teardrop of the tallow candle you carry in your trembling hand. You cross the woven rug with quick, deliberate steps, eager to reach the massive mahogany four-poster bed that dominates the center of the floor. The heavy velvet curtains enclosing the mattress remain drawn tight, forming a dark, monumental queue designed specifically to trap and hold whatever warmth can be generated. You set the brass chamber stick down onto the bedside table, watching a single drop of hot wax slide down the metal stem and congeal instantly in the freezing air. The storm outside lashes against the exterior masonry with renewed force, rattling the heavy interior shutters as if attempting to tear them from their iron hinges. A fine sift of powdery snow has actually managed to penetrate the microscopic gaps around the window frame, gathering in a tiny, pale drift upon the dark wood of the sill. By the hearth, the last remnants of the coal shift and collapse into a bed of useless gray ash, abandoning the room to the plunging temperatures. Humid cold of the chamber strips away the illusion of sanctuary, replacing it with the stark reality of Victorian winter survival. Even the heavy mahogany furniture seems to contract and groan under the atmospheric pressure, echoing the structural complaints of the sprawling manor. You reach for the edge of the heavy velvet bed curtains, slipping your fingers through the narrow opening left by the maid earlier in the evening. Pulling the fabric aside reveals the towering stack of woolen blankets and the pristine linen sheets that will serve as your final defense against the freezing night. The trapped air inside the canopy smells distinctly of the brass warming pan, a comforting blend of scorched fabric, wood ash, and the faint, dusty scent of heated feathers. You shed the outer woolen shawl, leaving only the thick flannel nightdress to insulate your body as you prepare to climb into the towering structure. The physical transition from the open room to the enclosed bed is a calculated maneuver, executed swiftly to minimize the loss of precious body heat into the cavernous chamber. You swing your legs up over the high wooden rail, sinking immediately into the deep, yielding mass of the feather mattress. The initial contact with the linen sheets is a shocking plunge into icy water, the residual heat from the warming pan having dissipated from the outer edges of the bed. You gasp involuntarily as the cold fabric presses against your back, forcing your muscles to tense in a sudden, shivering spasm. Desperation drives you to burrow deeper into the center of the mattress, searching for the small pocket of warmth that the hot coals manage to leave behind. You pull the mountain of heavy blankets up to your chin, burying yourself beneath layers of dense, suffocating wool that press down upon your chest with physical weight. Silence within the bed canopy is absolute, a stark acoustic contrast to the howling blizzard tearing at the slate roof above. The thick velvet curtains effectively muffle the sounds of the dying fire and the ticking mantel clock, creating an isolated microclimate severed from the rest of the freezing estate. It takes several long, agonizing minutes for your own body heat to begin reflecting back from the dense layers of bedding. The violent shivering slowly subsides into a dull, persistent ache that settles into your joints and bones. This is the nightly ritual of endurance, a quiet battle fought in the dark where the only victory is waking to see the pale light of another winter morning. You shift your position cautiously beneath the crushing weight of the wool, mindful not to break the seal of the blankets, and invite the freezing air inside. The mattress feathers compress around your frame, forming a customized mold that supports your exhausted limbs while simultaneously trapping the building warmth. You feel a sudden, sharp prickle as a stray feather quill pierces the heavy ticking and scratches against the sensitive skin of your ankle. The smell of the lanolin in the untreated wool becomes overpowering in the confined space, a rich, earthy odor that speaks of rural survival and basic necessities. You curl your knees towards your chest, adopting a tight, defensive posture that maximizes heat retention and minimizes exposure to the icy edges of the bed. You listen intently to the muted sounds of the house settling, your ears straining to interpret the various creaks and groans of the contracting timber. A loud, sharp crack echoes from the floorboards near the fireplace, sounding like a pistol shot in the hushed environment of the bedroom. You know the dropping mercury is forcing the floor joists to shrink and warp, a structural torment that will continue until the sun finally returns. The isolation of the 880 winter is profound, cutting the manor off from the nearest village and leaving the inhabitants wholly dependent on their own dwindling resources. You close your eyes briefly, visualizing the thick layers of snow burying the carriage drives and sealing the heavy iron gates of the estate. By the second hour past midnight, the temperature in the main chamber reaches its lowest point, freezing the water solid in the porcelain wash basin. The tallow candle on the bedside table sputters and dies, starved of oxygen or simply consumed to the end of its wick, plunging the room into pitch blackness. The dying embers in the grate offer no illumination, merely a faint, fading pulse of heat that fails to reach beyond the stone hearth. Within the velvet canopy, the accumulated body heat finally begins to neutralize the biting chill of the linen sheets. The heavy layers of wool act as a crude but effective barrier, holding the biological furnace steady against the crushing atmospheric pressure of the blizzard. You breathe carefully, noting how the air inside the canopy has grown warm and stale, tainted by the smell of your own exhaled breath and the heavy wool. The knitted cap secured over your hair itches faintly at the temples, but you refuse to remove it, knowing the critical importance of keeping your head insulated. You extend one foot tentatively toward the bottom of the bed, instantly encountering a zone of freezing linen that drives your toes back toward the warm center. The architecture of the four-poster bed forces you to remain confined to a very specific, heated radius, punishing any attempt to stretch or move freely. You accept this physical restriction as the necessary price for survival, a compromise made every single night during the brutal winter months. You feel the rhythmic thud of your own heartbeat echoing in the quiet space, a steady drumbeats marking the slow passage of the freezing hours. The exhaustion of the day's labors finally begins to drag at your consciousness, pulling your mind down into a heavy, lethargic state. You trace the woven texture of the blanket edge with your thumb, the coarse fibers providing a grounding tactile sensation in the black void. The storm outside seems to lose its distinct voice, blurring into a continuous low-frequency roar that vibrates through the very foundations of the manor. You surrender to the overwhelming weight of the textiles, allowing the dark, enclosed space to dominate your senses entirely. Deep within the bowels of the estate, the exhausted stoker likely continues his lonely vigil over the massive coal furnaces. The survival of the household hinges upon his ability to keep the black fuel burning, a fragile mechanical lifeline stretched thin by the relentless cold. Every resting soul in the manor, from the grandest guest to the lowest scullery maid, remains suspended in this state of vulnerable dependency. The architectural defenses of brick and mortar are secondary to the continuous, desperate consumption of the earth's resources. The night stretches out, a vast and unforgiving ocean of frost that the estate must navigate until the pale dawn breaks. You turn your head slowly against the linen pillowcase, the fabric crisp and still holding a lingering trace of cold from the surrounding room. The faint scent of dried lavender rises from the crushed herbs stuffed within the ticking, a fragile reminder of the summer garden now buried beneath feet of snow. You stare into the absolute darkness, finding that the visual deprivation heightens your awareness of the heavy, suffocating atmosphere inside the bed hangings. The air feels thick enough to touch, a dense mixture of body heat, wool fibers, and the stagnant breath trapped by the velvet curtains. You blink against the blackness, your mind conjuring faint, ghost-like shapes in the empty space above your face before logic banishes the optical illusions. Outside the velvet barrier, the freezing air of the chamber continues its slow, methodical conquest of the remaining heat. The brass warming pan, now stone cold, sits on the hearthstone like a dead artifact of comfort, its iron contents reduced to useless gray ash. The intricate frost patterns on the window panes thicken and harden, forming an impenetrable shield of ice that blocks even the faint light of the winter moon. The absolute lack of light forces the other senses to compensate, amplifying every tiny settling noise and distant structural groan of the house. The Victorian manor is a rigid, freezing tomb, holding its inhabitants hostage until the planetary rotation brings the sun back to the eastern horizon. You pull the heavy flannel nightgown down over your knees, ensuring no bare skin is exposed to the frigid gaps between the blankets. The friction of the coarse fabric generates a fleeting spark of static electricity, a tiny invisible crackle of energy in the dark confinement. You press your hands flat against your stomach, feeling the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of your breathing beneath the crushing weight of the wool. The physical effort required simply to expand your lungs against the heavy textiles serves as a constant reminder of the extreme measures needed to preserve life. You find a strange, grim satisfaction in this localized survival, a quiet victory won millimeter by millimeter by millimeter against the invasive cold. You listen to the wind change pitch, rising into a high, sustained shriek that penetrates the thickest stone walls of the estate. The sound carries the distinct, sharp edge of airborne ice crystals scouring the slate roof, a relentless abrasive force grinding against the mortar. You try to imagine the vast, empty fields surrounding the property, a frozen, featureless wasteland where no living creature could survive the night exposed. The isolation of the manor feels absolute, a solitary stone island marooned in a sea of lethal, freezing currents. You sink deeper into the feather mattress, grateful for the localized warmth while simultaneously dreading the inevitable moment when you must abandon it. The grand staircase in the center of the house remains pitch dark and deserted, its polished oak treads freezing solid in the ambient air. The portraits of austere ancestors hanging along the corridor stare out into the blackness, their painted features cracking microscopically as the canvas contracts in the cold. In the servants' quarters below the roofline, maids huddle together beneath thin, patched blankets, sharing body heat to survive the sub-zero temperatures infiltrating the attics. The hierarchical divisions of the household matter very little in the deep hours of the night, equalized by the universal, desperate need to stave off the frost. The estate is a collective organism, shivering and enduring as one entity against the crushing weight of the 1880 winter season. You shift your weight again, a slow, deliberate movement to relieve the dull ache building in your lower back from the unyielding mattress. The straw ticking beneath the layer of feathers rustles loudly, a dry agricultural sound that disrupts the heavy silence of the canopy. You feel the temperature inside the bed dip slightly as the movement pumps a small amount of warm air out through the overlapping velvet curtains. The instantaneous draft against your neck prompts you to freeze, holding your breath until the heavy fabrics settle back into their defensive configuration. You reach up to adjust the knitted woolen cap, pulling it securely down over your ears to block the stray, invasive chill. You run your tongue over your lips, tasting the dry, stale quality of the trapped air within your breathing space. The lack of ventilation is a necessary evil, a direct trade-off for the precious degrees of heat preserved by the dense hangings. You picture the frozen wash basin across the room, the layer of ice thickening hour by hour as the temperature inside the chamber mirrors the brutal conditions outside. The sheer hostility of the environment makes the simple act of resting feel like a defensive military operation. You focus entirely on the core of heat radiating from your own chest, ignoring the freezing extremities that border the edges of the mattress. Time loses all meaning in the absolute darkness of the enclosed Victorian bed. The ticking of the mantel clock is effectively muffled by the velvet, leaving only the erratic sounds of the storm and the house to mark the passing hours. The deep night stretches out indefinitely, a suspended state of existence where the only goal is to maintain the fragile equilibrium of body temperature. The manor house groans again, a long, low vibration that speaks of frozen timber and shrinking brickwork fighting a losing battle against the frost. The endurance required to outlast the winter is not merely physical, but a profound test of patience and stubborn will. You lie perfectly still, measuring the physical toll of the plunging temperature by the stiffness creeping into your joints. The heavy wool blankets press down with undeniable force, a necessary burden that limits your lung capacity while trapping your body heat. Outside the velvet curtains, the ambient air of the 1880 chamber has reached the lethal level of cold, transforming the room into an inhospitable icebox. The ticking of the mantel clock seems to slow, the mechanical oil within its brass gears thickening as the mercury drops. This is the dead center of the night, a span of hours where the estate feels fully severed from the turning of the earth. You listen as sharp cracks echo through the timber framing above the plaster ceiling, sounding like distant rifle fire in the hushed estate. The immense cold forces the massive oak beams of the roof to contract with immense force, pulling at the iron nails and wooden pegs that have held the manor together for generations. The structural agony translates each loud snap into a clear measure of the blizzard's relentless intensity. The heavy masonry of the exterior walls acts as a massive thermal sink, drawing every last fraction of warmth from the interior spaces and releasing it into the frozen sky. The house is a living, suffering entity, battling the elements with brick and timber while its inhabitants cower within. You feel a subtle change in the air pressure pressing against the heavy bed hangings, signaling a shift in the prevailing winds. The gale tearing at the slate shingles suddenly drops in pitch, changing from a high, abrasive shriek to a low, sustained moan that vibrates through the floorboards. This acoustic shift offers no physical relief, but it alters the sensory landscape of the dark chamber, introducing a new, mournful tone to the nocturnal isolation. The velvet fabric of the canopy absorbs the lower frequencies, creating a muffled, underwater quality to the sounds of the storm. You track these minor changes with a hyper-vigilant focus, your mind searching for any sign that the weather might eventually break. Faint, brittle sounds emerge from the corner of the room where the porcelain wash basin rests on its wooden stand. The crust of ice that formed earlier has now solidified into a thick, expanding block, the frozen water pushing against the edges of the ceramic pitcher. You hear a sharp, high-pitched ringing noise as the stress becomes too great, the sound of the freezing liquid testing the integrity of the vessel. The reality of the 1880 winter requires constant replacement of these shattered everyday objects, a hidden cost of enduring the brutal season. The frozen basin stands as a stark warning of what awaits any flesh exposed beyond the boundaries of the mattress. You bring your hands up to your chest, crossing your arms beneath the coarse wool to maximize the retention of your core heat. The tips of your fingers remain stubbornly numb. The poor circulation, a direct result of the body sacrificing the extremities to protect the vital organs. The thick flannel nightgown feels damp against your skin, not from sweat, but from the condensation of your own breath trapped within the unventilated canopy. This claustrophobic atmosphere is the inescapable price of survival, a delicate balance between suffocating warmth and lethal exposure. You endure the physical discomfort with practiced stoicism, accepting the harsh parameters dictated by the era and the geography. Down in the cavernous expanse of the great hall, the estate's hunting hounds form a tight, breathing mound on the stone hearth. The massive fireplace there offers only a ghost of its former heat, forcing the animals to rely wholly on their collective body mass to survive the plunging temperatures. You picture their coarse fur pressed together, their snouts tucked under thick tails, a primal instinct mirroring your own desperate burrowing under the woolen blankets. The medieval scale of the architecture punishes every living creature equally, offering no true sanctuary from the invasive frost. The shared misery creates a silent bond between the isolated humans and the working animals, enduring the same freezing hours. You trace the embroidered edge of the uppermost blanket with a stiff thumb, the raised thread providing a rare, intricate texture in the dark void. The repetitive motion offers a tiny mechanical distraction from the pervasive ache of the cold seeping into the edges of the mattress. The straw ticking beneath you shifts with a dry rustle, the sound magnified by the acoustic confinement of the velvet curtains. Each small noise becomes an event in the sensory deprivation of the deep night, a focal point for a mind desperate to avoid dwelling on the plunging mercury. The hours stretch into a vast, featureless expanse, requiring immense mental discipline to navigate without giving in to the oppressive gloom. You register subtle vibrations traveling up through the thick wooden posts of the bed, transmitting the frantic energy of the storm directly into the frame. The heavy mahogany structure shudders whenever a particularly vicious gust of wind strikes the exposed stone flanks of the manor. You sense these tremors in your bones, a physical reminder of the violent forces raging just on the other side of the frozen window panes. The sturdy Victorian craftsmanship holds the canopy firm, the tight joints in dense wood resisting the atmospheric assault with stubborn rigidity. You place a hand flat against the mattress, grounding yourself against the erratic trembling of the grand furniture. Distant, metallic clinking filters up through the ventilation shafts, a faint acoustic signature of the frantic labor occurring in the basement. The stoker is fighting a desperate losing battle against the cold, shoveling endless loads of black coal into the roaring belly of the primary furnace. You recognize the rhythm of the iron shovel striking the stone floor, a desperate percussion driving the primitive heating system of the 1880 estate. The heat he generates will never reach this isolated upper chamber, but he prevents the water pipes in the lower walls from bursting under the expanding ice. His hidden, grinding labor is the unseen foundation upon which the fragile survival of the household rests. You turn your head to the side, pressing your cheek against the icy crispness of the linen pillowcase to find a new unheated patch of fabric. The sudden contact with the cold material acts as a sharp stimulant, jolting your nervous system and banishing the heavy lethargy clouding your mind. The scent of dried lavender is stronger here, a fragrant echo of the summer harvest stored away for just such bleak and sterile nights. The botanical aroma cuts through the stale, wool-heavy air of the canopy, offering a fleeting sensory escape from the claustrophobic environment. You breathe in the crushed herbs, allowing the sharp scent to clear your lungs and sharpen your focus on the immediate surroundings. Tiny ice crystals begin to sift through the invisible cracks in the bedroom ceiling, driven by the immense pressure of the blizzard. The microscopic snow drifts down through the freezing air, landing silently upon the top of the velvet bed canopy. You cannot see this accumulation, but you know the architectural vulnerabilities of the old manor allow the winter to penetrate the upper defenses. The slate roof above is a treacherous landscape of shifting ice and driving snow, offering only a porous shield against the raw fury of the elements. The estate is slowly filling with the weather it was built to exclude, a terrifying reality of the 1880 climate. You pull your knees tighter to your chest, reducing your physical footprint beneath the blankets to the absolute minimum. The fetal position concentrates your biological furnace, allowing the layers of wool to trap a dense, spherical pocket of life-sustaining heat. The heavy fabric resists your movement, the friction of the coarse fibers dragging against the flannel of your nightgown. You lock your muscles into this defensive posture, knowing that relaxing your limbs will expose them to the frigid outer zones of the mattress. The discipline of the Victorian night is a physical trial, demanding rigid control over the body's natural impulse to stretch and seek comfort. Wine forces its way down the brick chimney across the room, creating a hollow, mournful hooting sound that echoes in the dark grate. The downdraft blows a spray of fine, gray ash out across the woven rug, spreading the bitter scent of consumed coal into the frozen chamber. You smell the sharp, metallic odor filtering through the gaps in the velvet curtains, adding another harsh note to the complex sensory stew of the room. The fireplace, once the vibrant center of the chamber, has become a cold conduit for the storm to invade the interior space. The architectural features designed for comfort now serve as liabilities, betraying the inhabitants to the plunging temperatures. You absorb the heavy, oppressive weight of the estate pressing down from above, the massive stone walls and timber beams creating a sense of physical confinement. The isolation of the deep night amplifies this feeling, transforming the grand manor into a sprawling, frozen prison locked in by the snowdrifts. The ornate plasterwork and dark wood paneling offer no psychological comfort when the ambient temperature drops below the point of human endurance. You exist solely within the narrow boundaries of the four-poster bed, your world reduced to the rough texture of wool and the faint scent of lavender. The vast echoing halls of the house belong wholly to the winter, surrendered until the servants return with fresh coal and daylight. Memories of the brief pale sunlight from the previous afternoon seem like artifacts from another lifetime, wholly disconnected from the current brutal reality. You try to recall the exact shade of the winter sky before the blizzard obscured the horizon, but the image is swallowed by the pervasive darkness of the canopy. The sensory deprivation of the enclosed space forces the mind to turn inward, magnifying every physical discomfort and projecting anxieties into the black void. The mental stamina required to endure these frozen hours is just as crucial as the physical insulation provided by the heavy blankets. You force your thoughts away from the cold, focusing instead on the mechanical rhythm of your own breathing and the slow, steady beating of your heart. You detect the sudden scurry of a field mouse navigating the lath and plaster, the noise breaking the monolithic silence of the estate. The tiny claws scratch frantically against the dry wood, a desperate, scraping sound that travels clearly through the freezing acoustic space. The rodent has sought refuge from the lethal temperatures outside, breaching the masonry to find a miserable sanctuary within the architecture. You listen to the frantic movement until it fades into the distance, a small reminder that the house harbors a hidden ecosystem of desperate creatures. The shared struggle for survival bridges the gap between the human inhabitants and the unseen vermin, all united by the singular goal of outlasting the frost. You run your tongue over your dry lips again, tasting the faint, metallic tang of the cold air that manages to seep through the velvet barrier. The moisture in your mouth feels uncomfortably cold, chilling your teeth and jaw as you inhale the stale atmosphere of the confined space. A fierce thirst begins to build in the back of your throat, an ironic torment considering the millions of gallons of frozen water locking the estate in ice. The frozen pitcher across the room mocks this biological need, offering only a solid block of inaccessible hydration. You swallow hard, forcing the discomfort aside and prioritizing the conservation of your core temperature above all other desires. Relentless atmospheric pressure continues to test the structural integrity of the Victorian manor with every passing minute. The massive iron hinges of the exterior doors contract, pulling at the oak frames with a force that threatens to splinter the heavy wood. You imagine the thick stone walls absorbing the glacial cold, storing the freezing temperatures deep within the mortar to radiate inward for days to come. The architectural battle is silent but catastrophic, a slow degradation of the building materials under the extreme environmental stress. You remain motionless within the bed, a fragile biological component shielded by layers of wool in the desperate hope of an eventual dawn. You know pale light will not appear for several more hours, leaving you suspended in this dense, freezing darkness. The mantel clock chimes the third hour past midnight, the metallic notes sounding dull and lethargic in the heavy frozen air of the chamber. You count the 3 slow strikes, acknowledging the depth of the night and the long stretch of endurance still required before the house begins to wake. The isolation is absolute, a profound separation from the rest of humanity enforced by the impassable snowdrifts and the lethal temperatures. You draw the heavy blankets a fraction of an inch tighter, settling into the grim, unyielding reality of the deepest winter watch. You shift your weight onto your left shoulder, the heavy mattress feathers conforming slowly to the new angle of your body. The movement sends a subtle draft down the collar of your flannel gown, a fleeting kiss of frost that raises goosebumps along your spine. You press the rough wool of the uppermost blanket tight against your neck, sealing the breach before the precious warmth can escape into the canopy. The physical maneuvering required to stay comfortable is a slow, calculated dance against the invading chill of the Victorian night. You settle back into a rigid stillness, your muscles locking into place to guard the localized heat. Bitter, metallic odors from the dead fireplace seep through the dense velvet curtains, tainting the stale air trapped around your face. The smell of cold ash and soot carries the grim reminder of the fire's failure to protect the room from the dropping mercury. You breathe shallowly, trying to filter the harsh scent through the edge of the linen sheet pulled up over your mouth. The olfactory landscape of the 1880 estate is dominated by the stark realities of raw fuel and freezing stone. You press your eyelids together in the darkness, trusting the immense weight of the bedding to hold the winter at bay until the servants return to clear the grates. You maintain your rigid posture as the fourth hour past midnight slowly approaches. The wind outside the estate seems to find a new, sharper pitch, whistling through the invisible cracks in the exterior masonry with predatory focus. This high-frequency sound pierces the heavy velvet curtains of the bed, a constant acoustic reminder of the blizzard raging beyond the stone walls. You feel the massive mahogany bed frame vibrate subtly in response to the atmospheric pressure battering the side of the house. The sheer force of the 1880 storm highlights the fragility of the human sanctuary carved out within the sprawling Victorian architecture. Endurance becomes an active, exhausting task, demanding your unwavering mental and physical concentration. Coarse wool fibers scrape faintly against your jawline every time you adjust the angle of your neck. The thick blankets represent the difference between survival and freezing, yet their immense weight creates a dull, persistent ache across your collarbones and chest. You slide your hands deeper into the center of your body heat, feeling the rough texture of the flannel nightgown beneath your palms. The air trapped inside the canopy is now thick and heavy, smelling strongly of lanolin, old cedar, and the metallic tang of the cooled brass warming pan. You breathe in slow, shallow increments, attempting to conserve the localized heat while managing the stale atmosphere of the enclosed space. The dark confinement of the mattress offers the only viable defense against the plunging mercury filling the rest of the bedroom. Frost continues to colonize the interior surfaces of the chamber, expanding far beyond the window panes. A thin layer of white rime is likely forming along the edges of the baseboards, driven by the intense cold radiating from the foundation. The porcelain wash basin across the room issues another sharp, brittle crack as the block of ice inside it expands further against the ceramic glaze. These distant metallic sounds map the exact progression of the freezing temperatures, claiming the unprotected zones of the estate. The hearth, devoid of embers, functions merely as a dark tunnel funneling icy downdrafts straight onto the woven rug. The grand aesthetic of the room has been subdued by the brutal physics of the winter season. You swallow carefully, the back of your throat parched from hours of inhaling the dry, recycled air within the bed hangings. The intense thirst is a cruel paradox, considering the millions of frozen gallons of water currently burying the grounds of the manor. Reaching for a drink is a logistical impossibility, requiring a perilous journey across the glacial floorboards in the pitch darkness. You press your dry lips together, accepting the physical discomfort as a necessary component of the nightly survival ritual. The human body is forced into a state of stark deprivation, stripped of all modern conveniences and left to weather the elements through sheer stubbornness. You focus on the steady rhythm of your own pulse, a reliable biological metronome marking the slow passage of time. You picture the abandoned, freezing corridors downstairs manifesting in your mind's eye. The grand dining room sits in heavy darkness, the polished mahogany table reflecting only the faint, ghostly light of the snow pressing against the tall windows. The leather chairs in the library must be stiff and unyielding now, the air in that sanctuary having surrendered fully to the invasive frost. The sprawling scale of the estate, designed to project wealth and power, now serves only as a massive thermal liability. Every empty chamber and vaulted hallway represents a volume of space that the central heating system has failed to conquer. The Victorian architectural ambition ultimately bows to the overwhelming, leveling force of the natural world. Subterranean vibrations occasionally reach the upper floors, indicating the stoker is still waging his desperate war in the cellar. The faint, rhythmic thud of the iron shovel against stone provides a comforting confirmation that the foundational fires have not been allowed to die. His brutal, back-breaking labor generates the steam that keeps the internal pipes from bursting, preventing a catastrophic mechanical failure within the walls. You visualize his soot-stained face illuminated by the harsh orange glare of the open furnace doors. The stark contrast between his frantic physical exertion and your forced rigid stillness highlights the diverse strategies required to maintain the estate. Both forms of endurance are critical to the collective survival of the household as the blizzard continues its assault. You listen as ice pellets begin to mix with the driving snow, striking the slate roof with a harsh, abrasive clatter. This new texture to the storm creates a deafening roar above the plaster ceiling, masking the more subtle creaks and groans of the settling timber. The granular impact evokes images of a relentless, frozen desert scouring the highest peaks of the manor. The change in precipitation suggests a slight shift in the weather patterns, though the ambient temperature remains locked in a lethal sub-zero holding pattern. You draw the heavy woolen cap tighter over your ears, attempting to muffle the chaotic noise bombarding the structure. The sensory overload from the storm outside contrasts sharply with the claustrophobic sensory deprivation inside the velvet canopy. You test the boundaries of your heated pocket, extending 1 foot down the length of the straw ticking. The boundary is absolute. The temperature drops precipitously the further you move from your core, the linen sheets at the bottom of the bed feeling as slick and cold as polished ice. You withdraw your leg immediately, returning to the tight fetal position that maximizes your thermal efficiency. This strict spatial management is non-negotiable, a biological imperative dictated by the severe limitations of the 1880 bedding technology. The heavy layers of wool trap your body heat, but they generate none of their own, making you the sole engine of your own preservation. You remain locked in the center of the mattress, an isolated island of warmth in a vast, freezing ocean. Distant chimes from the grandfather clock in the main hall eventually ring out, striking 5 hollow notes that reverberate through the floor joists. The acoustic signal confirms that the deepest, most dangerous hours of the night have finally been breached. You count the strikes with a sense of grim satisfaction, acknowledging the successful navigation of the prolonged darkness. The anticipation of morning begins to form a faint, conceptual anchor, even though the physical reality of the dawn is still hours away. The temperature in the room will continue to drop until the sun breaks the horizon, meaning the most critical test of your insulation is occurring right now. You brace yourself for the final, punishing stretch of the nocturnal ordeal. The hardest part is yet to come. You feel dull aches radiate through your hips and shoulders from maintaining the same cramped posture for so many hours. The feather mattress, initially a luxurious cushion, has compressed into a dense, unyielding block beneath your weight. You execute a slow, highly calculated rotation, shifting your mass while keeping the overlapping edges of the blankets tightly sealed. The maneuver requires significant physical effort, the heavy textiles resisting your movement and dragging against the flannel of your nightgown. A tiny sliver of freezing air slips past your collar during the turn, shocking your skin and validating the extreme caution applied to the movement. You settle back into the straw ticking, ignoring the muscular discomfort and refocusing strictly on the preservation of the localized heat. You detect the sharp metallic odors from the frozen window panes penetrating the dense velvet curtains. The smell of raw, unmitigated cold is distinct, carrying a sterile, abrasive quality that strips the moisture from your nasal passages. The scent lacks any trace of life, acting as a chemical signature of the planetary freeze gripping the countryside. It mingles unpleasantly with the stale, humid air trapped around your face, creating an olfactory landscape defined by harsh extremes. You press your nose into the rough wool of the uppermost blanket, preferring the earthy smell of lanolin over the biting scent of the frost. The sensory details of the Victorian winter are unforgiving, leaving no aspect of the human experience untouched by the extreme weather. Heavy stillness dominates the air within your immediate breathing space, a stark contrast to the fierce turbulence occurring outside. The thick bed hangings have performed their intended function, creating a viable microclimate that has sustained you through the lethal temperature drops. The architectural design of the four-poster bed proves its immense value, serving as a critical piece of survival technology rather than mere decorative furniture. You run a stiff finger along the edge of the linen pillowcase, feeling the crisp, icy texture of the fabric that lies just beyond the reach of your body heat. The frozen perimeter of the bed remains a hostile territory, enforcing your continued confinement until the household machinery groans back to life. Glacial pressures force the mortar between the exterior bricks to groan under the sheer strain of the dropping mercury. The sound is a low, continuous grinding noise that reverberates through the heavy timber framing of the canopy bed. You imagine the micro fissures forming in the Victorian masonry, the frozen moisture wedging the stone apart fraction by fraction. The estate is engaged in a brutal physical wrestling match with the elements, fighting a slow battle of attrition against the winter. You press your shoulder blades firmly against the compressed feathers of the mattress, absorbing the structural vibrations as a constant reminder of the ongoing siege. The physical integrity of the house is the only thing standing between you and the lethal wasteland beyond the glass. You conjure the memory of the weak afternoon sun striking the drawing room floorboards hours ago, desperate for a mental image of warmth. The visual recollection feels thin and inadequate against the crushing physical reality of the dark, freezing chamber. You try to recall the specific sensation of the radiant heat from the roaring hearth, but the memory fails to generate any sympathetic warmth in your shivering limbs. The sensory isolation of the bed canopy forces your brain to endlessly cycle through the immediate, harsh tactile inputs of coarse wool and stale breath. You release the futile mental exercise, accepting that the mind cannot overpower the stark, biological facts of the 1880 winter. The morning light remains a distant, theoretical concept, offering no practical relief for the current ongoing ordeal. You notice the atmospheric shift not as a sudden cessation of noise, but as a gradual easing of the high-pitched shriek tearing through the window frames. The massive mahogany bedposts cease their faint, sympathetic vibrations, allowing the mattress to rest perfectly still upon the wooden slats. You feel the tension in your own shoulders begin to uncoil slightly, the rigid defensive posture yielding to the pervasive exhaustion of the prolonged vigil. The howling wind that battered the slate shingles for hours finally begins to lose its sharpest edge. You listen to the structural groans of the timber framing becoming less frequent and less violent as the estate seems to exhale a shuddering breath. This is not the arrival of warmth, but rather a cessation of the active atmospheric assault that has terrorized the manor since nightfall. You accept that the brutal 1880 winter has established its dominance over the landscape, demanding a hushed, respectful silence from the surviving inhabitants. You breathe in a shallow, measured rhythm, careful not to disrupt the fragile thermal boundary established between the heavy wool and the freezing linen. The dense pocket of air trapped within the velvet curtains has achieved a delicate, stable equilibrium with your body temperature. You brush your chin against the coarse fibers from the uppermost blanket, the scratchy texture serving as a constant tactile anchor in the pitch-black chamber. The scent of the dried lavender in the pillowcase has faded, from a sharp, botanical tang to a muted, dusty sweetness that speaks of forgotten summer afternoons. You rest your right hand flat against your stomach, feeling the measured, mechanical rise and fall of your diaphragm beneath the thick layers of the flannel nightgown. The raw instinct for survival yields to the heavy narcotic pull of physical fatigue. You realize the house is no longer a battlefield, but a silent, frozen vault where the remaining task is to simply endure the final hours of the dark. You note that the distant sounds from the lower levels of the estate have faded into silence, leaving the upper corridors entombed in unbroken quiet. The exhausted stoker in the cellar has likely banked the main furnace fires, allowing the coal to smolder in a sustained, low-temperature burn that requires less active intervention. You listen to the rhythmic ticking of the mantel clock across the bedroom, reasserting its presence, the mechanical heartbeat separating itself from the dull roar of the fading blizzard. The layer of frost on the window panes has reached its maximum thickness, forming an impenetrable, opaque shield of solid ice that seals the room away from the exterior elements. You watch the invisible brass gears turning in your mind with relentless precision, measuring the microscopic fractions of the night as they slip away into history. The Victorian manor stands as a rigid monument to architectural endurance, its stone walls having successfully absorbed the most lethal temperatures of the season. You exist within the very center of this monumental defense, a fragile biological core protected by layers of brick, timber, velvet, and wool. You shift your legs a fraction of an inch, reveling in the localized warmth that has thoroughly penetrated the dense feather mattress beneath you. The straw ticking yields with a dry rustle, the agricultural sound isolated from the hostile environment existing just beyond the bed hangings. You feel the heavy, oppressive weight of the accumulated blankets transform from a burden into a necessary, grounding embrace. The friction of the flannel against your skin generates a faint, residual heat that soothes the dull aches lingering in your joints from hours of immobility. You blink into the void, finding that the darkness behind your eyelids is indistinguishable from the pitch-black atmosphere of the enclosed canopy. The sensory deprivation is no longer a source of anxiety, but a welcome retreat from the harsh, abrasive realities of the winter night. You allow your mind, starved of visual input and exhausted by vigilance, to begin untethering itself from the physical constraints of the freezing chamber. You hear the masonry of the estate emit a final, deep-settling groan, a low vibration that travels harmlessly through the foundation and into the frozen earth. The temperature within the bedroom has bottomed out, the ambient air achieving a state of sterile frigidity that will hold until the morning fires are laid. You picture the porcelain wash basin sitting silently in the corner, the block of ice within it expanded and locked into a rigid, crystalline structure. The dead coals in the hearth have surrendered their last faint traces of odor, leaving the room smelling only of ancient dust and cold stone. You recognize the stillness as the true character of the deep winter, a season defined not by violence but by a sprawling, immovable silence. The estate has weathered the worst of the meteorological assault, earning the right to rest beneath its heavy mantle of snow. You share in this collective exhausted peace along with the other inhabitants scattered across the various levels of the sprawling manor. You focus your attention solely on the physical sensation of the air entering and leaving your lungs, a simple biological cycle that requires no conscious effort. The measured rhythmic pulse in your wrist and throat eases its tempo, matching the lethargic, frozen pulse of the sleeping house. You acknowledge the sharp chill that occasionally sneaks past the velvet curtains without triggering a panic shivering response, dismissing it to a numbed nervous system. The heavy woolen cap, secured over your head, provides a consistent, comforting pressure against your temples, insulating the most critical source of your body heat. You allow your jaw to relax, the muscles unclamping after hours of tense, involuntary grinding against the cold. The boundaries between your physical form and the surrounding mountain of bedding begin to blur, the layers of fabric feeling like extensions of your own skin. You drift through the transition from waking endurance to the edges of rest, executing a seamless descent into a heavy, warm void. You visualize the intricate fern-like patterns of the ice crystals mapping the interior of the window, a beautiful, lethal artwork painted by the plunging mercury. The heavy velvet drapes across the room hang perfectly motionless, their thick folds acting as a final silent barrier against the frozen glass. You know the brass rings securing them to the wooden rod are cold and still, the metallic clinking of the earlier draft having ceased. The air in the room, stripped of all its moisture by the intense cold, possesses a brittle, fragile quality that seems to fracture slightly with every breath you take. You realize the darkness holds no more threats, only the stark, unyielding reality of a 19th century winter that has run its course. The survival mechanisms implemented hours ago, the hot brass pan, the layered flannel, the drawn curtains have proven sufficient to carry you through the crisis. You let the quiet confidence of this realization drain the final remnants of adrenaline from your bloodstream. You listen to the stark absence of human activity within the sprawling estate, the dozens of servants and inhabitants having all surrendered to the biological necessity of rest. The brass hardware on the heavy mahogany wardrobe reflects nothing in the pitch-black chamber, the metal handles frozen solid to the polished wood. You imagine the intricate carvings along the headboard of the bed remaining hidden, their elaborate floral motifs providing only a dense, tactile landscape if you were to reach out and touch them. The grand architecture of the manor, built to impress and intimidate, has been reduced to its most fundamental purpose of providing a hollow stone shell against the lethal elements. You trust the massive iron locks on the front doors to hold fast against the exterior drifts, securing the perimeter with uncompromising strength. The internal ecosystem of the house has reached its lowest energy state, a state of suspended animation that will persist until the sun begins to warm the slate roof. You exist as a silent participant in this collective hibernation, your breathing synchronized with the sluggish, thermal pulse of the building. You feel the exact texture of the linen sheet against your collarbone, the fabric remarkably smooth after absorbing a perfect degree of your localized body heat. A single, coarse thread from the wool blanket rests lightly against the back of your hand, forming a microscopic point of friction in the dark. You detect the faint, rhythmic creak of a floorboard settling in the hallway, a sound now stripped of all urgency or threat. The lingering scent of cold ash from the hearth mingles with the dusty sweetness of the mattress ticking, creating a complex, earthen perfume. You accept the immense, comforting weight of the blankets pressing down evenly across your shins and ankles, firmly anchoring your lower body to the bed. The subtle give of the feather mattress supports the curve of your spine with flawless precision, eliminating the need to shift or adjust your posture. You rest within the perfectly still air inside the canopy, a stagnant, warm pocket that requires no further defense. The specific sound of a stray snow crystal brushing against the exterior window pane barely registers in the hushed environment. The faint metallic tang of the cooled brass warming pan resting on the hearthstone drifts to the microscopic gaps in the velvet. The low, deep groan of a massive oak joist contracting in the attic vibrates through the vertical supports of the four-poster bed. The precise smell of the lanolin trapped within the layers of untreated wool fills the narrow space between the blankets and your face. The exact pressure of the knitted cap pulls lightly against the fine hairs at the nape of your neck. The distant, muffled thud of a shifting coal in the basement furnace travels up through the brickwork of the central chimney. The dark red velvet of the bed hangings absorbs every stray particle of light, rendering the space visually impenetrable. The measured, rhythmic settling of the house timbers creates a subtle, rocking vibration through the dense mattress feathers. You close your eyes. The winter will hold the estate safe until you are ready to wake.